Hi there, good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. I'm Dr. Sarah Gloser. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to our next in the series of masterclasses that are run through the School of Management here in the University of Bath. Today's session is focused on a topic that's very much close to my heart, an area of research for me, which is around dialogue in social media. So the purpose of today's session is really to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to be sharing some of my research in this area, and I'm quite excited to be sharing some new analytical work I've been doing. So for the first hour of today's session, you will be listening to me. And I guess the second and probably most important part of today's session is to give you a flavour for life at Bath, and particularly with regards to the postgraduate programs that we run. So without further ado, we'll get started. It's important to say that I teach across undergraduate, postgraduate programs here in Bath. I teach marketing and society at the moment, and I've been in Bath for about 4 years. So the hashtag is on the screen here. Feel free to use it. Please do follow our social media accounts. And what we will do is, after I finish speaking, I'm going to hand over to Naomi Love and Becky Gallagher, who will give you a bit more information about the postgraduate programs we have here. I thought it would be useful to give a bit of a flavour around me, who I am. So I'm an associate professor or senior lecturer in marketing and society in the University of Bath. My interest is around corporate social responsibility and predominantly communication. So I tend to describe my research as looking at two areas: how organizations communicate responsibly, and also how organizations communicate about responsibility. So I'm interested in the kind of process as well as the content of communication. I would describe my kind of broad interest in the broad premise of today's session on digital dialogue. And I look at digital dialogue in a variety of contexts. I look at Facebook, I look at Twitter, I look at Instagram. So when people look over my shoulder and see me researching and I'm in social media, I can legitimately say that this is just purely for research purposes. In terms of what we'll look at today, what I thought would be helpful to do is to think about kind of contextualizing this issue. Why is social media or virtual communication so important? Why now? I'm going to intersplice the kind of contextual and practical insights with some theoretical background, potentially quite philosophical discussion around the notion of communication and dialogue. I will also be coming on to thinking about some analytical tips. So what I'm going to do is almost think about how we can understand the social media communication space better, so that we can use these insights to develop more effective forms of communication, whether we're individuals, citizens or companies. So this is all about how we kind of generate meaningful interactions. So hopefully by the end of today's session, you'll have a good idea about the engaging research and teaching, the kind of cutting edge knowledge that we share here in the school, as well as you can see, the fact that this all takes place in a very beautiful part of the world here in the UK. So let's get started. So thinking about what is today all about, this is a big investment of time listening to one of these sessions. So I really wanted to make it useful and practical for you. And I think that if we consider how we communicate with one another virtually, I think a lot of the time the focus is very much on us providing opinions and putting information out there. And I'm a big advocate for listening. So not just kind of anticipating and reacting to what someone's saying online, but really kind of reading into the posts, the deeper meanings that perhaps are conveyed. So this is a discursive perspective, I guess, that I take on social media. I'm a qualitative researcher, and I think that this is such an important conversation to be having at the moment, because our lives are just so increasingly digitized. We are communicating with one another online, virtually, in a way that we have never really done before. And so I think if we take a step back and we allow ourselves to have a think about the ways in which that we're communicating and how we can perhaps do this more effectively, we can also develop a better understanding of one another. So I'm hoping that today will generate some new ideas. Now, this slide is one that's probably not super surprising to many of you. These are some statistics that were shared a few months ago, so January 2021, basically about the growth in social media. They found a big study was conducted, a big industry study, and the kind of key messages that I wanted to share around this study are twofold. The first is around the scale. We are spending roughly about 2.5 hours each week in social media. So the idea is that a large proportion, each day in social media, the idea is that a large proportion of our time is actually spent on our devices. And so social media is not necessarily just about providing opinions to businesses, to one another, but it's also a very functional tool. It's kind of a facilitator of our relationships. So on the back of the kind of growth, and there are big figures here around the numbers of people who are using social media and the growth of the kind of context. The second element I was keen to share is the growth of mobile. So the main, if you look at the last little red bubble here, the percentage of total social media users accessing via mobile is 98.8%. So what we're seeing is that actually we are using social media in a way that's often responsive on the go. So our comments to one another can be extremely reactive. They're not considered as perhaps they would once be, where we would sit down and have a think and tweet or write a message. We are very much interacting on the go. And as a result of that quick interaction, perhaps we often don't get the opportunity to really consider what the other person is saying. So I think that we need to understand the broad premise and the benefit of social media. So the idea is that social media is about generating togetherness. It's about bringing people closer together. Quote there from Mark Zuckerberg really brings this point to life. And I think from a kind of analytical perspective, what's really interesting is that social media have helped to transform what have been thought about as information processing models of communication. So the idea that there is an active encoder of a message, a marketer, for instance, in a business, and they then transmit this message to a passive decoder who thinks about that message and then acts on it. So in the context of marketing, you kind of get a message, you think, okay, this product looks great, and you go and buy it. There's like a really streamlined linear process. But actually, social media has turned these kinds of forms of theorizing on their head, because what it's enabled us to do is to understand the consumer as a co-producer of knowledge. They are very much creating branded communication knowledge. They are embedded within networks, so individuals themselves create knowledge without perhaps even the brand manager or marketeer being involved. So this is a really interesting way of understanding the kind of premise of social media, that it democratizes, that it enables access, it enables people to have voice at a scale that has never been really possible. Now, what I'm saying now isn't particularly new. Social media have been around for decades now. But when we take into consideration the scale and the pace with which our usage of them is developing, I think these kinds of considerations are really, really important. And the idea that the consumer is almost moving from this kind of passive person to a very much active kind of co-producer of knowledge. Yet, on the other extreme, we can perhaps challenge this notion of democratization and say, do companies really listen? Okay, if we're thinking about this from the perspective of a business, do these people who are at the receiving end of our kind of social media posts really take them into consideration? There has been research to suggest that perhaps we're not able to understand or utilize these mediums in the way that they're intended, because we still use them as broadcast mediums. We still pass messages out. And this is what we could argue is a very monological approach. It's a very one-sided, message transmission approach, where the other, the person on the other end, isn't necessarily indeed listened to or responded to. And then some of my more recent research has looked at the idea that social media are perhaps still deemed to be spaces that need to be controlled for risk, reputational issues, that businesses actually want, of course, to kind of create some boundaries about the knowledge that's created in these forums and keep it online, kind of on organizational line. So in doing so, they want to suppress any forms of dissensus. They want to see a very aligned message about the business and fall. But this is very difficult to kind of manage in an age of what we can term polyphonic, multivocal social media settings, which are indeed followed and interacted by hundreds and thousands, maybe more individuals at any point in time. So whilst there is perhaps an appetite to listen more, often we see that, practically speaking, businesses don't have the resource, perhaps they don't have the inclination to listen. It's a time-consuming pursuit to keep on top of social media, unless you have dedicated people being able to manage this for you. And indeed, there's also a balance to be achieved between the idea of wanting to be super responsive and almost being a bit creepy and listening to consumers all the time, and also taking a step back. Getting that balance right can be quite difficult. So the argument that I would like to make today is an argument that I think that we should try to consider social media sites as what I kind of use the analogy of as a petri dish for consumer learning. So we can see consensus, we can see dissensus unfolding in a way that might be indicative of broader shifts within society, that we can look at the social media setting as this little ecosystem where we can see perhaps where there are areas of issue in the business or areas that perhaps we're doing well in the business. So we can actually gain a huge amount of insight from really looking into the posts in more detail. So a quote from a recent paper where I spent time actually just for quite a long duration of time was that actually the form of dissensus that might unfold in these sites can be productive of new knowledge. It can provide these kind of momentary forms of consensus. It can provide areas of benefit, but it can also perhaps give some indication of future policy changes, of public sentiment on certain topics. Indeed, if topics continue to keep coming up, perhaps there's a message there in terms of also reputational weak spots. So these spaces are symbolic spaces for listening, but they're also very strategic. And they perhaps provide some kind of crystal ball that we can utilize in terms of thinking about how we can move forward elements of our business practice. And this idea of listening to consumers is not a new one. The idea that if you don't listen to consumers, someone else will is a kind of phrase that has permeated business practice since the 1950s and 60s. A quote there from the founder of Walmart. And then Dana Boyd, who does some fantastic research in the area of social media, social networks, argues that it's kind of the gasoline that keeps the business machine going. So we are using these tools to a great extent in what we do. And I think that if we consider the current context in terms of the pandemic, the need to be responsive, the need to show empathy, the need to show a meaningful connection is only enhanced. So this idea of being able to be responsive and to listen and to respond to consumers through social media is really heightened, I would say, in the current day and age. So let's have a little bit of a think about how this might look theoretically. So dialogue is an area that I look at and I find a really interesting area to explore, because what it tells us is that there are different ways in which we communicate with one another. And a lot of the time, the kind of theories that we used are premised on face-to-face interaction. So tools for good dialogue would include, as you see in this photograph here, people sitting in a circle, active listening, eye contact, body language, being open to discussion. So you may have a point of view. You may come into dialogue indeed with some kind of preconception. But the idea is that you are able and willing to shape your preconceptions in interaction with one another. So dialogue is a transformative process, which is founded on the belief that joint meaning is created between co-present individuals, and that meaning on its own is almost impartial or incomplete. The reason that we talk with others is to better understand what I and they mean, hoping to find new and more satisfying ways of being together. So the notion of dialogue is one that spans back to kind of Greek philosophy, the works of Plato. It's not a new idea, but in a business context, it has been popularized, I would say, around the last 4 or 5 decades, and particularly in management, in the notion of corporate responsibility, I would say in the last decade or so, because what this helps us to understand is not how we as a business may have an ultimate goal that we're trying to persuade others to kind of entertain, but the idea that our knowledge, our kind of knowledge structures are framed and developed in relationships with other people. So it really creates a beautiful platform for this notion of active listening, for empathy. And it's upon this basis that I find dialogue so fascinating. Now, there are different ways in which we can understand dialogue. It can be often a process of trying to generate forms of consensus. As I've mentioned, it's transformative. But more often than not, it's actually a learning tool. It's an opportunity for others to learn about one another. It's very exploratory. And I think that if we try to kind of take these principles, and they are principles which are, as I say, very kind of theoretically and philosophically aligned, and they're very different from the kinds of communications that we could talk about, let's say, if we're trying to launch some kind of a discussion or conversation, that there are words that are almost synonyms to dialogue, and dialogue is thrown about as a term, let's have a dialogue. But what it actually means, as I say, is that there's a kind of deeper belief taking place, that there's some form of kind of joint meaning creation happening. And as I say, this area is one that I've been studying for a while. I've been involved in doing a big systematic literature review across the management discipline in terms of looking at the way that dialogue has been theorized. So there's some really interesting research around this area. Now, what we have to think about is that this is all well and good, but the way that we understand dialogue in the social media in a virtual context is very different, right? So that social setting that I just provided to you with the people sat around in a circle, they have eye contact, they're talking to one another, they can read body language. This is all lost in a social media context. So what your dialogue looks like is something like this. Now, this is just a screen grab from a kind of Facebook conversation on the Coca-Cola Facebook page. And you can see dialogue looks really different. There are opportunities to see replies. There's a little indentation. The way that the interface is designed is to show dialogue. So you can see who is responding to who. And there are cues here, there are, emojis, there are capital letters that we're going to come on to in a little bit of more detail. But this is what your dialogue looks like. So there's a lot that you have to convey through text. And what I think is most interesting about thinking about dialogue in social media is this idea that it's absolutely never ending. Anybody can join the conversation. So your little close-knit circle of a few people speaking and listening is blown out of the water, because anybody who wants to have a presence in the dialogue can be present. Anyone can have a voice, as long as they have an internet connection, and we're talking about public fora here, then they can speak. So there are differences between face-to-face communication and social media interactions that need to be anticipated, need to be understood. The first is this idea that conversations are asynchronous. So we are not together in the same space. We might be, across different time zones. We might be, jumping in between different points of the day. The interface is designed in a way to make it look like the dialogue is fluid, but it's not. And this idea of kind of synchronicity is really, really interesting. There are also a few other ways in which we can understand the differences between kind of online and face-to-face interaction, and Kozinets. Rob Kozinets has done some kind of online ethnographer and ethnographer, has given some really useful indications of where there might be differences. So he argues that there is alteration. So of course the technological medium which facilitates the conversation makes the actual notion of dialogue different, so that we have to be able to use different cues in our language to convey emotion, whereas in face-to-face we would use our kind of body language. We don't know who these people are. In an online world, we are disembodied. We can create a profile and a picture and a name, which bears no resemblance to our kind of real identity. So the area of anonymity is a really, really interesting one, that we don't always know who the people are who are engaged in this social media setting. As I've mentioned, the idea of accessibility, these dialogues are open to participation, so we can see a social media setting as a big dialogue taking place, and anybody who wants to have a voice, to have or share an opinion on a particular topic is able to join. And as well, from a business perspective, and perhaps this is what fuels the idea of control most specifically, is the idea that social media content is persistent, it's sticky, there's an archive. And this idea that digital information is stored indefinitely is one which I think is really interesting, because there's a legacy there. There's a legacy of content, there's a legacy of interactions taking place. So on this idea, the kind of premise is that as one person speaks, as one person posts, somebody will be listening, somebody else will be responding. We don't know who they are, we don't know where they are, but there's this broad idea that as we're engaged in online interactions, there will be some response. But how do we get attention? What is it that we need to do to grab people's attention online if we're missing these face-to-face cues? Well, we provide opinions, we provide views. Let's say your online shopping hasn't arrived. Let's say, a retailer has done something that's really annoyed you. What are the discursive cues that you use? Well, you share your views, right? You go online and you tell said retailer that you're super angry. But what about if you want to make more emphasis? What do? Well, you use capitals, right? Perhaps you use profanities, perhaps you use exclamation marks. The message here is that you're super angry, give me attention, okay? You're shouting at the retailer. You can also use emojis, as we saw there in the Coca-Cola post. You would try to convey your emotion in a way. These are very popular ways of trying to capture what your emotion is actually saying in lieu of face-to-face interaction. Or you just repeat yourself, right? You go online and you keep saying it over and over and over again. And in my conversations with practitioners, it's important to say I came into academia from the world of practice, where I worked in brand teams and communications teams and corporate affairs roles. And when I've spoken to colleagues and practitioners, they say scale is the issue. So the more a topic is mentioned and the more posts that come through, the more difficult it is to ignore. So that's a great strategy in terms of repetition. And I mean, there are ways that we can analyze social media in terms of scraping data and looking at sentiment. What I'm thinking about here is the ways that we try to communicate and what we try to do to convey meaning. And in order to do that, there are a few different tools available to us that are designed to help us understand the trajectory of dialogue. So if we go back to the theoretical idea that I started off with about dialogue, this idea of individuals coming together to create a kind of joint meaning, new meaning. One of the ideas that I really love has been developed by an author, Sullivan, in 2012, Paul Sullivan, and he develops this idea. So he uses dialogue and he thinks about how we can use dialogue in an analytical way, a qualitative analytical way. And he argues that we are born needy. Now, I quite like that idea. And it basically says that this idea that, on our own, knowledge is partial. We have to engage with one another to make ourselves understood, to understand the social context that we're operating in. So for a business, the only way we we are kind of knowing our truth is to engage with one another. And he develops these really exciting ways for how we can look at text and determine dialogue. So the first is around sore spots. So this is your kind of classic case formation of showing somebody that you're angry. You provide a strong reaction to the other's words. So dialogue is taking place here because there's some form of exchange. Someone is angry, right? They're giving you their opinion and you're kind of trying to interpret that. The second idea is that actually in social media posts, we show responsivity, not in terms of responding to an event, but also with regards to the kind of internal dialogue that we have with ourselves, that we create others' points of view and we kind of develop them in relation to our own positions. So you kind of, the idea of is that what they really think? These ideas where you perhaps show a question that you kind of vocalize what is happening in your head gives the individual who's responding and understanding your text a really vital access point into perhaps the way that you're thinking, this micro level of internal dialogue, which I think is wonderful in terms of thinking about how we make sense of ourselves. We can often get a window into that. Also words with a sideways glance. So you might be fearful of another's judgment. So don't take this the wrong way, but a phrase like that is wonderful in terms of showing that you are probably anticipating that the person is going to take this the wrong way. So from a business perspective, if consumers are using these kinds of disclaimers, it perhaps gives a little bit more of a clear indication of actually the fact that they're perhaps thinking the opposite of what they're saying. And finally, stylization. So the idea here is you look for almost fragments of dialogue of discourse that has been said before. So you kind of echo what has perhaps been referred to before. You perhaps provide some form of paraphrasing. And that, again, is a brilliant way of showing dialogue because it shows that you're connecting something that has been said previously to the current context. So you're kind of keeping that. So just a few discursive tools, I would say, for what we can look for in terms of, firstly, understanding that dialogue is taking place. Now, what I thought I would do is kind of two things for the last portion of the talk today. The first is to give you an indication of how we want to initiate dialogue. So if there are consumers out there, or if we are consumers, what it is that we do aside from angry letters and exclamation marks. How do we initiate dialogue? What are some of the discursive strategies that we do to get attention? And this is really important because the online setting, as I say, is disembodied, it's anonymous, and it's polyphonic. There are so many voices out there. There's so much noise. These sites are attended by hundreds, thousands more individuals. So how do you get cut through aside from just posting about how angry you are over and over again? So what I'm going to do is give you 3 ideas for perhaps strategies that, and these are empirical ideas that have come through from my research, my published research, how individuals try to initiate dialogue. And then what I'm going to do is give you 5 kind of steps that we can go through to not only interpret the dialogue, but then also think about how we can develop or perhaps mirror or model these strategies enabling us to kind of show that we're listening, enabled to kind of thinking about developing some more meaningful dialogue in terms of the way that we also communicate. So the first strategy I'm sharing with you is one of voice. So this is the idea of, okay, you've got your mega speaker, right? But how do we get attention through our words? And some of the research I conducted in Facebook, looking at corporate Facebook pages, developed this idea of what I termed discursive authorization. So because these spaces are so busy with noise, often times we don't understand who somebody is. We know who they are perhaps presenting themselves as online through their Facebook profile picture or their name, but we don't really know who they are. And so from a company perspective, you almost want to try and generate some form of basis, a foundation upon which you can make some kind of knowledge claim. So what I found as a strategy with individuals would assume a credible voice in relation to other voices. So they would actually draw on social roles and identities in order to tell a story of who they are. Now, an example here, as a British consumer, James posted on this particular Facebook page. And I saw this happen time and time again. You know, I'm a mother, I'm a farmer, I'm a you know, a child. You know, I have children who are living, you know, going to school near one of your retail sites. The idea here is that you are giving some kind of position upon which you are able to make a kind of rational request to an organization. I'm an employee of your business. I saw that a lot as well, internal kind of reactions playing out in these external forums. So what you do is you essentially add some form of discursive weight to your position. So you say, you know, as a British consumer, I want to make informed choice about the products I buy. Can you request that products are clearly labelled in terms of ethical certification? Perhaps this is about local provenance. This consumer wants to buy local. Perhaps this is about national sovereignty or consumer rights. But the idea here is that James provides a very basic social foundation upon which he can then make his claim to the organisation. So voice is one of the first strategies I was keen to share with you all. The second is then, once you've developed this foundation, or you've tried to give a little bit of an insight into who you are, is you then need to give some indication of your credibility. You then need to provide some form of expertise. So it's not just that I am said father or said mother or said farmer who's producing, you know, this product that's going into your stores, but that you actually have really expertise in the social role that you have. And with this idea is what I've termed discursive validation. So you actually provide truth claims about your kind of right, your kind of legitimate right to having a voice in this particular space. And there's three ways that this happens, that evidence is given, if you will. The first is what I term normalization. So this is about giving, you know, a normal perspective of this is the kind of bar that you should be reaching, right? This is a superior moral high ground, and I'm going to be able to kind of pull you up if you're not sticking to this kind of social norm. So this would be with regards to a comment of something like, I hate plastic bags, they should be banned. It's a very normative position that they take. And what would happen from a quote like this, most often than not, is that there would then be some kind of very rich description of why plastic bags are so are so bad, of you know, perhaps rivers nearby, that one of their stores that are full of plastic bags, and the wildlife that is impacted. So they recreate these very emotive accounts upon this kind of normalized stance of, you know, you should be using this moral high ground, and upon which then, of course, an opinion is formulated and a claim is being made, and you should be doing this. The second kind of approach is about identifying inconsistencies. So you said you're doing this, but actually you're doing this. Now, this is a beautiful dialogical strategy, because what you actually see is some comparison between what has been said previously, so retrospective position, and what is happening now. So you get this dialogue, this kind of temporal dialogue across these different domains. And you would see this a lot, particularly with retailers that have very strong kind of history around responsible business practice. I keep coming back to responsible business practice in my examples, because as a corporate responsibility scholar, that's where my research more often than not takes place. So you would get these lovely quotes. You have an excellent record with your positive ethics in your history, but please could you carefully consider X, Y, Z, or you used to do this, but now you do this. Now, this doesn't match up. So this idea of almost identifying kind of forms of hypocrisy provides a nice insight into how dialogue is cutting across individual forms of perhaps documentation, different forms of evidence within the business. And they can be, you know, super critical friends in terms of identifying different points within which you have perhaps not done what you said you were going to do, or the talk and walk are not aligned. And finally here, in terms of rationalization, This is simply where you provide actual evidence. This could be with regards to kind of organic paraphrasing. Earlier in the post, either in this thread, somebody said X, Y, Z, or it could actually be explicit text that's inserted. See this link. It's interesting to follow that link, see where that link's going. Gives a great indication of where your consumers might be generating their knowledge from. But also from a dialogical perspective, it's brilliant because it shows to us that there are voices, actual voices in the dialogue, but there are also these kind of immaterial voices, additional voices that come into being. So that's the second form. And then just finally, the third way in which I see dialogue kind of being initiated or perpetuated is this idea of trying to challenge dialogical finalization or discursive finalization. So going back to the idea that businesses try to control their social media spaces, we often see businesses trying to curtail dialogue to an ideal end point. So this can be around generating consensus. Great, we're all in agreement, let's move on. Or a kind of more coercive measure would be to silence dissensual voices, deleting posts, blocking individuals from social media sites. Now, the idea is that, and a brilliant strategy that I've seen stakeholders, consumers use in these social media settings is to challenge consensus, to get attention by playing devil's advocate. So a quote from one of my paper here, anonymized retailer. For those of you who've been waiting for an update on our intentions regarding CCTV in our slaughterhouses, take a look at our Facebook page. So they've just provided this wonderful post. They've listened to what consumers want. Consumers wanted some more insight into, there was lots of discussion around animal cruelty that kind of was taking place before this announcement took place. And a great response from a consumer. So, okay, great. So you've done that. So what about now? Let's think about trade union rights. So what actually happens is that you take the context and then you take it in a completely different direction. And what that then does is it means that the dialogue isn't closed down. We know that dialogue is never ending. There's always a new perspective, and that keeps the dialogue going. It makes it very challenging from an organization to control, but it keeps the dialogue from a consumer perspective fresh. So yeah, maybe we see these strategies taking place. Maybe one of them gets cut through and we get some attention, perhaps as a result of this. We see individuals, that angry individual at the start, perhaps seeing that their voice is being listened to. But how pervasive is this issue? How particularly pervasive is the particular angry consumer? How common is this consumer of sentiment within the social media space more broadly? And this is where I'm now going to just talk through 5 steps that I've developed, kind of analytical steps that are designed to perhaps give an indication of where and how dialogue is taking place in forums, but also how you can, or how we can all, whether we're thinking about this from a practical perspective as a consumer or a corporation, or indeed if we are academics and people who are interested in researching these settings, what we can decipher from what's currently taking place in terms of perhaps what we need to do to think about how we communicate more broadly moving forward, moving to this kind of more meaningful approach to communication. Now, these steps are not necessarily linear steps. There are also steps that can be developed in isolation. But what I wanted to try and do is give you a flavour for the process that I go through when I look at a social media setting, how I analyse it. So the first approach really is one, I don't want to labour the first couple of points too much, but it's just about trying to find your data, how you kind of cast your net wide, what it is that you're interested in. So you have this social media setting. What is it within this setting that is the most important for you to focus on? Because these settings, these sites are full of text, right? There's so much there, it's overwhelming. Many organizations have had Facebook pages for nearly a decade or so now, at least. So when you think about trying to understand them, it can be massively overwhelming, particularly for a qualitative scholar like myself. So what I suggest is almost that there are 2 approaches to thinking about your social media setting as data. So the first is thinking about depth, that actually what you really want to do. is gain a rich contextual knowledge of the social media setting. And a brilliant way to do this is something like ethnography, online ethnography. You go in, you spend time reading, listening, maybe even posting, responding as if you're an individual within that setting. The second option, which is less focused on depth, is more about breadth. And this is perhaps a slightly more going into more quantitative territory, where you think about perhaps scraping data from a social media setting, or conducting some kind of automated search. And then within that breadth of data, you can then identify bits of the picture that are most interesting for you. There are also tools that kind of combine a bit of both. So I would say something like the tracking and trawling method is really, really helpful, because what that enables you to do is capture live posts as they're happening, with also focus on some of the retrospective discussions that are taking place. It is time consuming. Both of these approaches have their pros and cons, which we don't have the time to go into today. But I've given you some citations, and I'll give you references at the end if you want to follow up and look into them. So this is really your choice. Are you interested in thinking about, say, big data, trying to understand the social media site in its entirety, with a focus on individual, say, elements of text? If there's kind of an area which we're going to come on to that you're particularly interested in, you can distill data down from here. Or is it that you're trying to get that contextual knowledge? And as I say, that's where a kind of more immersive approach would be of benefit. Now, the second area is about selecting your level of focus. And this is about trying to draw some form of boundaries around the social media kind of space. Is it that you are thinking about, let's say, the topic of plastic? So you're interested in thinking about all consumers' thoughts around plastic. You can think about this just by identifying, a keyword, and then going through your kind of extracted data and highlighting that particular word, finding instances of that particular word. Or it could be that you look at a co-occurrence of words, so plastic and unacceptable, or plastic and good, and you then do some form of map. So that's a content analysis is a great approach. You can also look at interaction. Now, given that I'm interested in dialogue, conversation analytical approaches would suggest that you look at turn taking. So who speaks, and then who speaks next, and you kind of analyze the dialogue at that level. The approach that I have kind of forwarded is one of looking at both. So you look at both the level of text, but you also look at the interaction. So you're trying to identify, let's say, an interest in plastics, but you're not just looking for instances of every time plastics is mentioned, but you're looking almost at the trajectory. So where plastics conversations have come from. So all the conversations that have talked about plastics previously, but also perhaps more recent conversations regarding plastics, where they might be going. You have a look at the kind of instances that occur across a dialogue. Now, when I talk about dialogue here, what I mean is there might be specific threads that you can extract. So you're looking at how this notion of plastics has evolved within a particular dialogical thread. Or it could be that within the social media space in its entirety, if we take that as a dialogue, we look at the kind of evolution of the term plastics over a duration of time. So this is one way of thinking about how we perhaps start to filter the data down, this kind of textual or interactional level. Now, if we want to try and draw boundaries further, what I talk about is determining intensity of dialogue. So I almost the kind of frequency with which, again, going back to this notion of plastics, the notion of how frequently this keeps appearing. How much is this of an issue to consumers within the business? How prominent perhaps this is, and this is about trying to start to declutter, to take the noise away, to try and decipher, so what actually is the dialogue about? So that there's kind of two approaches that I've used. One is around temporal bracketing, so considering the dialogues that you're looking at, thinking about it in terms of time. So is this about real-time dialogue? So you're interested in conversations that are happening at the moment. Perhaps there's been some kind of crisis. Perhaps there's been new legislation that's been announced. Perhaps there's been a campaign by consumers regarding plastics. It could be that at the moment you're interested in conversations around plastics. Or it could be that actually a year ago something took place, or you're looking at the trajectory of time since plastics were first mentioned in your social media forum to now. That will be thinking about temporal bracketing, thinking about the trajectory of dialogue. The second approach would be in terms of themes. So identifying this kind of micro interest in plastics and also related terms, climate change, carbon reduction, biodiversity, and then thinking about trying to ascertain dialogues that include these particular terms and then looking at those in interaction. So you're kind of finding these almost sub-themes. And from there, you can start to ascertain some kind of tone. You know, is this being mentioned in a positive way? Is our stance on plastics strong enough from what consumers are saying, or potentially not? Again, this is not just about simple sentiment analysis. Of course, there's a very simple way that you're able to kind of take a scraped data set and think about interactions. And sentiment, so positive or negative sentiment regarding a particular topic. But what I'm really focused on is not taking that word out of context, about looking at the dialogue. So what kinds of comments were coming before a certain point in time when a particular phrase was identified, and what happened afterwards. So again, it's thinking about this trajectory. And this is where I've found sometimes that content analysis processes and approaches are slightly problematic, because they can take text out of the dialogue. And what I'm saying is we need to have a look both in terms of the threads, but also in terms of the social media space. So yeah, this could be thinking about temporal bracketing, thinking about posts that all happened today or yesterday, the last week, the last month, every Tuesday for the last year, or particular crisis moments, as well as thinking about certain themes that might be evolving in the business. And what are those particular themes? What do they look like? What are the keywords that are being used, and how within the social media space? The fourth and the kind of penultimate element and step, if you will, in thinking about the dialogue is to think about the idea that dialogue only takes place when there is a move and a response. So now what we're doing is we're kind of going to a more granular level. So we've kind of extracted our threads of interest, and we have made sure that they're on topic, that they're focused around a particular area that we're in, a particular time we're interested in. But what we're thinking about now is trying to find that listening is taking place, because a lot of time online we are met with silence. We post something online, we don't get a response. It just disappears off into the ether. Is there a body? Is there a person out there listening? Maybe. We have no idea. So the only way we can really tell that an interaction has taken place, that someone has been listened to, is to look for these cues. It might be that there's a tick next to a message, let's say in WhatsApp. It might be, in a tweet or a Facebook post that somebody has liked, or kind of given a thumbs up or whatever to a particular post, an indication, thank goodness, that someone is listening. But what about if we think about this in the context of the discourse? What can we tell about the discourse that shows that somebody has listened to us? So this is where we start to think about how is dialogue occurring and who is involved, and how we identify this idea of reciprocation. How can we show that there has been some exchange of knowledge taking place? There's been some form of joint meaning creation, that people are listening to one another. And the very simple way to think about this, there's two ways. The very first simple way is this idea of erotetics, a very fancy term for talking about something very simple, which is looking for evidence of reciprocation through questions and answers. It's thinking about how we see that there's been a question take place and there's been an answer. Of course, we could simply identify a question mark. We can identify an @ sign. So an individual has perhaps reflected and commented back to an individual. It might be somebody's name that's shown. So you've replied. As I showed in the Facebook post earlier, there's also nested replies. So you can see where a post has been replied to. So it kind of provides an indentation within the interface. That's very, very helpful. But another way we look at this in terms of the discursive level is to think about finding cues or similar cues in both content and tone. So we can see that there's been perhaps a shared continuation, some kind of form of reflective empathy, if you will. Now I'm going to give an example to make it a little bit less abstract for you. But the second point to mention is this idea of interlocutors. Again, a fancy term for talking about the people who are in the social media setting, who are the most active participants. This individual is going to, how do they make their kind of knowledge claims? This could be a very, very important stakeholder for us. As well as thinking about individuals who perhaps commonly posting across the social media space. So individuals who are continually engaging with a social media setting, perhaps a passionate advocate, perhaps someone who could create some problems for the organization if we're not listening to them. So clearly social media spaces are inclusive of many different kinds of voices. There are many different interlocutors, many different individuals who are kind of taking place. But what we're also thinking about here is that a lot of these people might be silent. There might be people in the space who are listening, but their voices are not being kind of made present. So what we want to look for is these cues for individual active voices, as well as some of the voices that are perhaps more immaterial or evidence that there are other people involved. And of course, we're interested in this idea of sustained engagement. We're interested in those voices that are very pertinent and very present, because these are the people who are forming a large part of the fabric of our social media space. If we think of this as, say, an organizational text that is being actively shaped, these are the people who are helping to shape it for us, for the good or the bad. So here is an extract that I took from the co-op page. And I've provided a few elements which I would like to emphasize to you in colour. So if we take a look in blue, so there's a little arrow here that's provided at the top, which perhaps just gives an indication of turn taking. So the co-op has posted something and Paul has responded to this particular post. So we see already there's evidence of errotetics, there's evidence of an exchange taking place. And we can see that the company is listening, because a little bit further down, they also then refer to individuals by name. Good, okay, there's a tick for dialogue there. But what we see in purple is perhaps indication that the business is trying to close down the comment. Okay, they're trying to reach finalization and close down the dialogue. I've passed your comment onto the Plan B team. Thanks. You know, we'll take a look at what you say. Kind of seriously, and we'll take it offline. If it's ever really looked at, we would never know. But in terms of the purposes of this dialogue, it seems like it's been addressed. However, the individuals continue, you know, new voices come in, new questions are posed. And what we see in pink, if we scroll down to the kind of bottom of the post here, is that there's some positivity. So the sentiment is indicated through the smiley faces, which gives an indication that perhaps this dialogue has been well received. So the people involved are quite happy. It suggests that it's a very productive dialogue, because there's some positive forms of consensus from a business perspective that have been shown. And interestingly, also in turquoise, a kind of or links give indication of sight. So you see that the cup is kind of drawing on evidence, as we mentioned before, to help show or rationalize their position. And this is really, really helpful, but because perhaps when you get these points of you know, questions, but what about XYZ? Would you be holding training courses, for instance? The organization is coming back with these forms of evidence, and indeed so are the interlocutors in the space. They're using kind of reference to certain guidelines, and as a result of that, perhaps its particular dialogue is worthy of agreement, and then from there individuals move on. So quite a nice way of thinking about how we can break down the dialogue. So finally, just thinking about how we determine what I term interpersonal dialogue. So this is just finally thinking about the goals of dialogue. So once we've been able to give our positions, and we've had these discussions, and we've made it clear who we are, and from our perspective as analysing these spaces, we can also think about how we can understand why dialogue occurs. And we can think about this with regards to how individuals shape meaning into a new context. So they paraphrase something and then kind of give it back to us in their own words. But also the idea that there may be more than one voice. We assume that there is one individual developing posts, but perhaps that individual is indicative of a collective of voices. So this is all about trying to understand how truths are contested online. So to just give you finally a little idea of how this might play out. So this is a post, again, from this particular retailer's Facebook page. It's been anonymized, so I've called the retailer EO. A wonderful post here from a consumer who lists all of her social roles and identity positions. So I'm a member, my husband is a member, we have all these current accounts, why I'm a loyal fan. Now this idea of why is wonderful. Who is this person responding to? Who is this other that they are directing their comments to? Why are they going through listing these social roles? Well, I guess the easiest way to think about this is that this is the business. They're talking about the business, but could it be another consumer that they're trying to persuade? They're also making a rational claim here. They're also making a rational demand for the retailer to stop selling a particular newspaper. Perhaps they're also appealing to readers of that newspaper. So there's a really interesting kind of double voice dialogue, so to speak, going on here, where you see this kind of individual presenting their position, but drawing on different strategies, this kind of rhetorical question, bringing another, who is the person that they're perhaps anticipating reading here, or upon which they then make a rational claim. So perhaps, again, by going into posts in detail and really reading through, we can understand the strategies through which organizations may be targeted through specific consumers in order to make change in the business. So this particular consumer listing all of position to then make a rational. I share this, but perhaps a deeper idea of thinking it from the dialogue. It's essentially what we've talked through over the period of the last hour or so. We've talked through how we perhaps think about different steps to how we initially think about analysing dialogue. And then these are the different elements that we go through. And I call this a digital approach to dialogue analysis. And these insights will be forthcoming in a chapter which will be published next year. And I was keen to bring them to life because I think it's a really nice how we can dig deeper into social media in lieu of face-to-face and embodied. So I'd like to just thank you all for being perhaps for your own strategies. If you are thinking about this from a business perspective, perhaps you have ideas for how you can perhaps consider how you think about social media and the ways that you communicate. If you're interested in this from an analytical perspective, hopefully you have some more ideas. But just before I finish off, I just wanted to highlight, I guess, the main takeouts from today's session. So the argument here is that social media sites are almost kind of petri dishes for learning. If we think about how we understand how dialogue takes place, we can understand the trajectory of dialogue by understanding these sites not just as a symbolic space for understanding, but this kind of really rich potential for learning. So this is very much an advocation of a kind of two-way approach, which is focused on speaking and listening, or reading. And what we've looked at are three ways of kind of strategy with control attention, as well as steps through which individuals can take to both analyze and understand the space and perhaps respond in a similar way. So how we can perhaps model our answers or the way that we approach on different strategies that are being used in our I hope it's an interesting. I'm aware of log so far in way. Here are some of the references that I've drawn, and I'll just pop that slide up for a moment. And in the meantime, what I'm going to do, I'm going to hand you over to Naomi Love, MSc programs, Becky Gallagher, who will talk more about our MBA programs. So Naomi and Becky, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a really fascinating session. So yeah, I've certainly learned lots, and it's given me plenty of food for thought. So hello everybody, my name is Naomi Love and I work in the MSc Careers team in the School of Management. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes now talking to you a little bit about Bath, the city and kind of where we are and what we care so much about as the city that we're based in, as well as introducing our MSc programmes before I hand over to my colleague Becky Gallagher, who will talk to you a little bit about the MBA offering here at Bath. So in terms of Bath, you can see a lovely picture there of the city centre. Bath is a beautiful city. We are very lucky to be based here. So if you've ever been lucky enough to visit Bath, you will know that it is a really beautiful city. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's very vibrant. It's very enthusiastic. Students, residents, tourists all live in harmony in the city. So it's a really beautiful place to come and study. It's very accessible, it's very easy to walk around, soak in the atmosphere and enjoy your time studying here. You'll see there's a QR code on this slide. If you want to find out more about what it's like to be a student in Bath, then I'd really recommend you take a look at that. So please do scan that and find out more about the city that you could be based in, because it's a really beautiful place to live and to study. If you're not familiar with the geography, we are based in the southwest of England, so we are really well placed for lots of accessibility. We've got mainline links across the UK, so you're able to travel and see lots of the UK from the city of Bath. We're around 90 minutes to central London on train, so it's very easy to get to and from our capital city of London. And we're really well placed with 2 international airports within easy reach. You can really easily access Bristol Airport and Heathrow Airport from the city as well. So we've got a very nice positioning in the UK. We're very lucky to be in the southwest, which is, you may guess from the fact that I live here, my favourite part of the UK. So very pleased to live here. It's a really beautiful part of England. In terms of our MSc programmes and our MSc offerings, we have a really broad range of programmes on offer. There really is something for everyone. For many of our programmes, you can be applying from any background, any kind of discipline. So there's really opportunities for many students to come and study master's programmes with us. I wanted to highlight a couple, starting with our Masters in Management. This is a programme we're very proud of. It's one of our flagship programmes, and particularly proud of the choice that you get if you study our Masters in Management here at Bath. The choice in modules allows you to tailor the programme, whether you are tailoring it to current interests that you want to develop further, whether you want to tailor it to look at new ideas and new concepts that you're maybe interested in exploring, or perhaps you want to kind of tailor your Masters around your career plans. The Masters in Management has that flexibility, and there's lots of choice for you to really kind of tailor and flex the course to really suit your needs and your interests. We have a suite of finance programmes that includes our accounting, finance with banking, and finance with risk management. And for those programmes, we would be looking for students that have really high quantitative academic backgrounds. So if you're interested in finance, then it's worth getting in touch to find out more about what we'd be looking for places on those. And we also have a range of specialist degrees. So these are a really good opportunity for you to really enhance your core management principles and your core management knowledge, as well as specialise in a particular area, whether that be business analytics, engineering, human resources, lots of options in our specialist degrees. For a couple of them, so for our MSc in marketing, you would need to come with some background in marketing, and for our human resource management and consulting, we'd be looking for some business background for applicants. But for the majority of other programmes, we can accept applications from any background really. So whether you've studied business before or whether you're looking to move into the area, our specialist degrees provide that opportunity to enhance your knowledge in those different areas. And we also have a couple of online degrees. So these give you an opportunity to study remotely, perhaps alongside working, if that is something that would be of interest to you. I'm going to talk now a little bit about some of the highlights and the features of our programmes. So our master's programmes are full-time for 12 months, run from late September to late September each year. Applications are open at the moment for September entry this year, and we'll be looking to open applications in September for September 2022 entry. So that'll give you an idea of our timelines for the applications. We are really proud of our research-led teaching. I think this morning has been a really good example of the research that goes on in the School of Management, and our academics are very, very involved in research, and they really bring that to the classroom. So by studying one of our MScs, you can be sure you'll be having some of that real cutting edge and current research brought into the programme that you are studying by our wonderful academics, which Sarah has given a really good account of this morning. I'm sure you'll agree. If you join us at the School of Management, you'll be part of a really vibrant international community. Our master's students and our faculty come from more than 50 different countries, so there's a huge international network that you'll be joining as a student at Bath. When travel was allowed, we obviously had opportunities on our programmes for international experience through our global residency opportunity, and that's something that we are hoping to be able to offer again in the future. But regardless of that, there are opportunities throughout the programmes to really engage in that international experience, to ensure you're really building a global network, you're thinking about all of the context of your course in a really global perspective, and you're having that opportunity to really enhance your international experience while studying at Bath. We're also very proud of the wellbeing support that we offer. We have a team of dedicated student experience officers who are there to support our MSc students, and they offer support both for studying but also personal support. We want to ensure you get support for your whole experience while you're studying with us. This is supported by our academic colleagues and a really fantastic MSc office team who will be there right from the beginning of your application journey right through to when you graduate from the master's programme. And all of this is supported in addition to the excellent university wellbeing support that is on offer for all students. So you can be assured that you'll be well supported while you're at Bath. That is support for one-to-one, but also proactive skills support. We want to develop your skills whilst you're studying with us, and that extends to the career support. So as I mentioned, this is the team that I'm part of. We work really closely with students on all of our MSc programmes to offer really proactive and tailored career support throughout your time with us. We offer workshops right from week one, and most often we offer workshops and opportunities before you even start, for you to start thinking and understanding and getting to grips with what your career plans and ideas might be. So whether you're looking for recruitment in the UK, elsewhere in the world, want to go on to further study, the careers team are here to support you. We offer one-to-one support, so you'd be more than welcome to meet with us for CV checking, mock interviews, understanding the UK recruitment process, and we have our timetabled career support for you as well. We work really closely with a network of employers. We have probably over 300 employers that we engage with across our programmes, and they will engage with you on your course as part of your kind of core opportunities, but also in extracurricular opportunities as well. So we work really closely with our academic colleagues to bring that professional and practical business experience to your programmes. Whether that's through project opportunities, company visits, guest speakers, there's a real opportunity as part of the programmes to engage with our corporate partners, to understand and start applying your academic knowledge and academic experience to real businesses and the things that are going on currently in the world, and to engage and understand more about how you can transfer that knowledge into careers in the future and bring an understanding of that back into the classroom as well. Hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of our programmes, what we offer, and the features that go alongside them. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Becky Gallagher, who's going to talk a little bit about the MBA side of the opportunities.
Thank you very much, Naomi. So the Bath MBA programme can be studied either full-time over 12 months or part-time over 2 years. Both programmes will give you a boost to your career goals, whether this be within your chosen industry, transferring to a new industry, or starting your own business. Both programmes offer a mixture of classroom teaching and practical hands-on learning. The full-time MBA programme. So the full-time MBA programme offers you choices to tailor-make your MBA to suit your career goals. There are core components followed by a range of elective options, and then the final multi-project suite, which brings together your theoretical classroom-based learning into real-life situations. Career support and guidance is built into the programme from the very beginning. You'll receive one-to-one coaching as well as attending workshops throughout the year. And the careers team will also promote any internships and full-time roles to you, and it's available to you 3 years post-graduation. Our part-time executive MBA programme is studied over 2 years. Our programme includes core modules and then a consulting project which reflects a real business issue in your organisation. And full career support and guidance is available throughout the 2 years. We are currently accepting applications for starting this September and October. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi and Becky. I'd like to just thank you on behalf of the University of Bath, the School of Management, for your time. It's been great to have you all here. We love running these sessions and sharing a slice of life at the university and the great work that we do here. So in the next few days, we'll be sending you an email with a recording of today's session and some further information about our posters. So we're very much interested in speaking to you, to continuing this dialogue. So please do keep in touch. For me to say is thank you so very much. Enjoy your weekend, and we hope that we will speak to you or see you very soon.